Good morning. Today is the 20th day of Tammuz, the 17th of July, and we're up to the second reading of Devarim. And the first parsha in the book of Deuteronomy. We gave a short introduction about the book itself yesterday. I didn't stress enough yesterday that in spite of the fact that we say that Moses first spoke these words, maybe I said it, but I wanted to stress it even more today. The same words were exactly what it was told to write by God. So even though it wasn't dictated to him the same way that the first four books were, there is no question that every verse here is also on par with the four first books of the Pentateuch. I want to look today at Moses' recounting of the story with Jethro. It seems to be the story with Jethro, even though he doesn't mention him. And he says like this at the very beginning of our reading, which is Deuteronomy 1:12. We'll start from 13. He says like this: ready yourselves, meaning prepare for yourselves men who will be wise, understanding, and known, or knowledgeable among your tribes, and I will appoint them as judges and as heads of the tribes. And you replied to me and said, it's a good thing what you want to do. And then in verse 15, I took the heads of your tribes, men who are wise and well known, and I placed them as your heads, and the ministers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens, and officers of your tribes. Now this is a topic that if we would have started learning together from Exodus, we would have seen it back then, but we'll see it here today. That the advice, actually there were 7 different categories or traits that each of the judges needed to have, and in practice Moses only found people with 3 of the traits. And specifically Rashi says here about I took men who are wise and well known. He says aval nevonim lo matzati, I couldn't find men of understanding or men of comprehension. Understanding and comprehension are very similar, the same root in Hebrew. They're a little bit different though. These are 3 of the being having comprehension or having understanding is one of the 7 traits that Jethro spoke to Moses, but Moses could only find men with 3 of the traits, that they were pious, tzaddikim, wise, and well known. And again, the question now becomes, what does it mean to be wise, to be understanding, and to be knowledgeable? This becomes very important because these are the 3 faculties of the intellect, and they're obviously different from one another. This is what we call Chabad. Chokhmah, Binah, Da'at is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So they're all intellectual, but they're different. They relate to very different intellectual faculties. So Rashi also goes in verse 13, where it's first mentioned, and describes, he identifies and defines what these words mean. He says, Chachamim ksufim. Ksufim literally means someone who yearns, who has yearning. A wise man is a person who we would describe as a vessel, an empty vessel, that is like think of a tree that is dry and is searching for water. And so any wisdom that he can pick up, he will. So that is a wise man. A wise man, we define it in later in Chassidus and Kabbalah, as somebody who has self-nullification. And because he has self-nullification, he is constantly yearning to hear more. In other words, a person who has a strong feeling of ego, a strong sense of I already know, that type of person will not yearn to learn from anyone. But the wise man is one who always feels empty, always feels that he wants to learn. So that's how Rashi describes them, as men of yearning. Nivonim. What does it mean to be a man of comprehension or understanding? They understand a thing from a thing, meaning they can extrapolate. Or, as we call it today, usually we call it today, we would think that this is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning means that you start from an axiom and you deduce theorems from that axiom. Other truths that you feel are correct based on the axiom that you started with. And then Rashi quotes for us a story from the Talmud that a Gentile by the name of Arios asked Rebbe Yosei, what is the difference between a wise man and a man of comprehension or a man of understanding? And he answered to him like this: a wise man is like a very rich, very wealthy money exchanger. He changes money from one type to another, from large coinage to small coinage, and so on. He says, when they bring him large coins, he inspects them. But if nobody brings him any large coins to break down into smaller coins, then he just sits idle. He has nothing to do. But a man of comprehension is like a money exchanger who is also a merchant. And therefore, if they bring him large coinage, he looks at it and he's willing to break it down into small coinage. But if nobody is bringing him anything, he goes out and seeks money himself. He seeks the large coinage himself and offers his services. So this is a very interesting thing, because on the face of it, it would seem that what he's describing is a little bit of both. Meaning, going out to seek sounds a little bit to us like the man of wisdom, like the man who is yearning to find wisdom, yearning to find it. The money exchanger who's not going anywhere, so that's like the wise man here. That's interesting. It seems that he's not going anywhere. And yet, the man who is of comprehension seems to be on the move. And he's yearning to get the large coinage, to break it down and to make us profit. So this is a very interesting definition that the Talmud offers and the Rashi copies for us. To put this all into perspective, I'll try to say in a few short words something that we dealt with also briefly, but at least a lot longer than what I'll be able to speak about now. Chapter 5 of a book called Wisdom, which is about integrating Torah and science. And chapter 5 deals with the definition of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And the bottom line is like this, that Torah uses both inductive and deductive reasoning. That was uncommon in the ancient world. Why was it uncommon? Because if you read Aristotle, for instance, or you read anybody who was building a logical system in the 4, 5, 6 centuries BCE, then you'll see that they are almost entirely based on deductive reasoning. And Aristotle is the height of that. What does deductive reasoning do? It starts from a truth that you think is true, and then it analyzes what else can you say based on accepting that statement as true. That's called deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning was much more rare. And what does inductive reasoning say? Inductive reasoning says, if I have seen one black swan, well, actually, if I've seen, I think all swans are actually white, right? So if I've seen one white swan, and I've seen 2 white swans and 3 white swans, then I don't deduce, but I induce that all the swans that I will continue to see are also white. What is the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning? The difference is that the inductive reasoning is uncertain. You can't be 100% certain that you won't come across a black swan after 1,000,000 swans that you see. There's no certainty because you're not deducing, you're inducing. Meaning you're taking one case and you're building it into a general principle, and arguing that since this is the general principle, I can continue on and assume that this will always be true. Inductive reasoning was not considered to be, maybe rightfully so, a very good basis for thought in the ancient world. Instead, the ancient world preferred what we call deductive reasoning. They preferred to start with statements that they felt were 100% true. There was no way that they couldn't be true. For instance, one of the famous ones, which turned out to be not true, of course, is that if you drop a kilogram, well, they didn't think about it exactly as a kilogram, but if you drop a kilogram of metal from a tower and you drop a kilogram of feathers from the tower, then the kilogram of metal should arrive quickly, more quickly than the kilogram of feathers. It turns out that it's not true. And the reason it's not true is because the initial statement is untrue. And the only way you can know whether an axiom is true or not is actually by just assuming that it is. Of course, once you assume that it is, any statement that you get out of it, well, you can rest assured that it is true because you deduced it out of the initial statement. Inductive reasoning requires you to have faith. Deductive reasoning doesn't really. Because if you accept the preliminary axioms, and they did in the ancient world, then everything that can be deduced from it is 100% true, and that's why they preferred it. Inductive reasoning would mean that it would have to have faith somehow that what I've seen in nature, that the initial example that I have is somehow correct. The Torah is studied by both of these. We start with axioms that are inductive, meaning we take a verse and we say that this verse is correct 100% because it was given by God, and let's see now what we can deduce from it. So we both do induction and deduction at the same time. We do both. On the other hand, the non-Torah viewpoint again was just to use deduction and not use induction. Today the tables have flipped, and it's actually science that is now based on inductive logic. Science starts by empiricism, which is a collection of facts and an attempt to state a truth based on those facts, but it's an inductive truth because, as we know, we could gather new data which would contradict the initial data, and then we would have to change our whole understanding. So actually, science has come full circle and adopted the Torah stance of taking induction. Yet, there is still a difference. The wisdom in the Torah is such that, or let's not call it wisdom, let's call it the inductive reasoning in the Torah is certain. The reason it's certain is because it's based on a verse that was given by God. That's the way it's considered. The inductive reasoning of science is still uncertain. But what they are the same about, and this is how science is now closer to Torah than it ever was, is that the uncertainty that you have in both cases, whether it's induction based on a verse or induction based on a series of observations that gave you data, the uncertainty causes you to not be, let's call it, arrogant. The thing that is most troubling, if you hear a scientist who is arrogant, so you understand that he's a very poor scientist right away, because the uncertainty within induction, which is what is used today, leads the person to have humility before nature, coming and saying, I don't know for certain that this will hold in 100 years. In fact, I don't know if it'll hold 10 years. I don't even know if it'll hold 1 year. But what I see right now is that this is true. In Torah, the uncertainty, which also exists, comes not from the fact whether I don't know if this will hold or not, because I know it will. The uncertainty comes from the fact that the source of this knowledge is not from myself. The induction began with a verse that had to be brought down to me in order for me to have any ability to analyze it using inductive knowledge. So let's just sum up. Wisdom is not either inductive or deductive logic. Wisdom is the yearning, the feeling of emptiness that I want to study, I want to learn. Understanding contains two types of logic, which we call inductive and deductive. And what Moses couldn't find was the people who could perform the higher form of logic, which is the inductive type of logic. And knowledge is something entirely different. Knowledge is what we call consciousness. It's the ability to take the knowledge that I have, the intellectual understanding and wisdom that I have, and to transmit it into the heart to create a state of mind, which is what knowledge is really referring to, the state of mind that the person is in. So I'm sorry that this is so short. There's so much more to say about it. I recommend, at least as a first reading, to see what we wrote here in chapter 5. And then, God willing, maybe sometime we'll give a whole course on the different types of logic in Torah and elsewhere. Thanks very much for joining. And